We're about to start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Start off your morning with some editing sessions. So my name is Jose Bañuelos. I'm a senior product engineer for the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript. And we have my colleague, Jonathan Uline.
Don't want to feedback too hard. Are we good? Hello? Cool. Oh, it works. Great. We had feedback issues earlier, so I was worried. So, John Uline.
So we're going to walk everyone through some introduction to web editing using JavaScript SDK, and we're going to go into some more intermediate and advanced custom workflows as well, so you can experience everything from introductory level to intermediate and a little bit more advanced, using some custom editing workflows that might not be available from our site yet. So our agenda for today is I'll start us off talking about how we prep our data for editing, because we can't start editing our data if we don't have editable feature services. And then John's going to walk us through available components that you may use in your web applications as well. And then we're going to have a deep dive into editor as well. I'll then start talking about the use and importance of form templates and how we can have an authoring experience using smart forms and the online or portal workflows. And then we're going to start diving into the editing with the JavaScript SDK, so programmatically using the feature layer.applyEdits. And then we're going to start diving into a little bit more custom workflows for some demos that we created for today's presentation. So all the demos that we showed today and the slides are going to be available in this GitHub repository. So if you're curious about the code we share or the applications and want to have access, plugging your data maybe, you'll be able to have everything we showed today available to you all. So I'll give you a minute to take a picture. And then we'll also have this slide at the end in case you need more time. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, prepping our data for editing. We need, so this is the workflow from ArcGIS Pro. You may be familiar. So when you're publishing a feature layer for it to be available for editing, we have this UI where we can even configure if we want to have adding, deleting, update, disabled, or enabled, or any combination of the three. We're going to show some workflows on how editor becomes responsive based off the settings you choose to publish. So in this screenshot, we're only showing update and delete available. So anyone using this data will only be able to delete features or update existing ones. You will not be able to create any new ones. Online also has that similar approach. So you can choose whether after publishing, you can set whether you want to add, delete, update, or any combination of those. Disable geometry updates or only enable attribute updating. So the online portal experience also allows you to configure your editing configurations on the feature service. So let's walk us through a demo showing the responsiveness of editor after you've published your data. So here we have two layers. We have a protected areas marine data set where the current layer that's currently visible is only enabled for add. So we can only create features. So you see editor is currently responsive and it doesn't allow me to select the select button that's available in the UI because currently the data can't update or delete it, only create new features. So the feature template still allows me to create new features and set any properties initially on creation, but I won't be able to go back and make any edits. I'll be able to see the pop-up, but I can't edit this data any further. So now if we switch to the data set where we have update only, we'll see editor's feature templates become disabled. So I can't create any new features, but I can update any attributes and yeah, I can update any attributes without any issue. So this is just an example of no matter how you set up your data, when you publish or author your data, editor, the widget from the JavaScript SDK reacts to the data set you're working with, so you don't have to worry about potentially allowing users to edit data you didn't intend on allowing them to edit, whether it's geometry, attributes. So now we're going to go with John to talk about some of the out-of-the-box components from the JavaScript SDK you can work with within your applications for editing.
Thanks, Jose. The JavaScript API or SDK provides a number of widgets out of the box to help with editing. A list of them is on the screen. Attachments for adding and removing attachments, editor for general editing as far as geometry, attributes, and attachments. Feature form is specifically for attributes. Feature table is more of a tabular view. Again, only attribute editing via the table. Feature templates is for selecting templates to use during the create process in other widgets like editor. Snapping controls lets you determine, the kind of snapping rules you might want for features that you're creating or updating to ensure that they, are valid after geometry updates. Sketch is kind of our underlying tool for actually drawing the geometries themselves, and it's used in various other widgets. There's also the version management widget, which, as the name implies, lets you manage what version of the data you're currently working on and lets you freely move between different versions. And utility network validate topology widget, a bit of a mouthful, but it helps you, validate your topology for your utility network. And that, comes back to snapping and ensuring that the right features can be connected to the right places, right? So also on the screen is just screenshots of the various widgets. All of them are available in our SDK. There's samples for them if you are curious about, specifics about an individual widget. And what's cool about these widgets is, widgets are building blocks, right? So we can take other widgets or the logic from those widgets in the view model case, and we can use them to combine more powerful editing widgets, right? So in the editor's case, it's actually a combination of a bunch of our editing widgets, right? So feature templates for determining what the symbology looks like, feature form for determining the attributes, sketch view model for actually drawing the geometries themselves. And it works with snapping controls to ensure that what you're drawing is valid, right? And then once you've actually, created some sort of feature, you can actually add or remove attachments to it, right? So editor is kind of like the best of all these things in one place. And a little bit more about editor. It's kind of our flagship editing widget, as the name implies. Out of the box, like I said earlier, it allows you to edit attributes and geometry updates, and it honors fine-grained editing permissions for these specific types of updates in terms of add, update, and delete. So you can do things like disable attribute updates, when you're updating feature, but then allow users to, create features with new attributes. And then, you can turn off geometry updates for features you've already created, but obviously when you want to create features, you want the user to allow, place geometries. So all of that is highly configurable down to a specific operation during the edit workflow itself. And other things that come with editor, like I mentioned, is snapping. Tooltips and editing constraints we'll talk about a little more detail after. They're a little bit newer, but it lets you be a lot more specific with the edits you intend to make to your geometries. We support arcade via the feature form. It will execute saved arcade expressions in your web map to generate attributes where you've defined these expressions. So that when you open your layers in any editing app using the editor, it will always be consistent and be the same. You don't have to do anything other than load the web map. Another new feature is related records. We let you browse and edit related records on features as long as your web map is configured correctly, and we can talk about that a little bit more. It relates to a couple points below with FormTemplate and smart forms. And editor supports 2D and 3D. It really doesn't matter whether you're using a map view or a scene view. It all just kind of works without any sort of specific configurations for that. Snapping. So we added snapping a number of releases ago, but the general idea is we have these kind of orange graphic indicators called guides. And the different symbols used by those guides kind of indicate the kind of snapping that you're doing. And this isn't just like I snap a point to a line. This is things like I can force an angle to be 90 degrees, right? So it's more self-snapping, so to speak, in that sense, right? But utility network leverages this. A lot of other things really leverage this kind of, the snapping behavior to create correct geometries without, the worries of are my geometries actually touching the boundaries and things like that, right? So, and while you're actually drawing, all of that is kind of tied to the control key, so you can toggle it on and off depending on how you've configured the tool. But it lets you kind of on the fly, enable or disable it. You're not tied to it for the entire drawing operation. So tooltips and editing constraints, this is pretty new. So when you're actually drawing, we show a tooltip with general information about what you're actually drawing and based on the context of where you're drawing. So for example, in a scene view, if I'm drawing, I'll see things like elevation. I might, that doesn't necessarily apply in the 2D sense, but just as an example of the things that you might see different between 2D and 3D. And what's really nice about these tooltips and editing constraints is you can actually enter into them and change values on the fly. So it lets you manually enter text values for your coordinates and locations and things like distance. You want a segment to be a line segment to be 100 meters, you can actually effectively apply that kind of logic using these snapping constraints. And I'm going to give it back over to Jose, and he's going to show you a little bit more on the snapping.
Thanks, John. So let's jump into our demo. So first, we're going to start with how we bring in the editor widget into our applications. We're going to show two examples, just the editor widget and then the editor component using the new map components available. So basically, we're bringing in a... Yes, of course. So good, or a little bit more? Okay, so here we have the web map ID for what map we're bringing in. So this is going to be some, this was for the first marine example data. So we're just bringing in the web map, we're creating our view, and then with 2 lines of code, we're initializing the editor widget, passing in the view, and assigning it to the top right corner. This also has the layer list application. But now for comparison, if we wanted to use the new map components, this is equivalent of this previous application with just 4 lines of code. We initialize our map and pass it the web map ID. We give it the ArcGIS editor component, and we're also passing in the ArcGIS layer list component. So equivalent, and this is the same amount of, this is the exact same application with less code, which is just loading a different web map. So now let's see that application in action. So here we have some New Zealand parcel data, and we'll notice if we want to activate any snapping configuration, on load I already have this pre-configured. I'm going to walk through the code in a little bit to show how we did this. But so just wanted to show how if you wanted to programmatically enable snapping on load so you don't have your users or the application users have to do this manually every time they load their application, you can do that for them. We have the tooltips enabled as well, so we can see the tooltips and jump into the editing constraints when we're actively drawing. So let's start drawing some parcel data. So with snapping, it allows me to create a parcel just within that same region. So I'll see the right angle indicator, and then I'll see the parallel lines indicators to ensure we have an accurate rectangle we're actually drawing. So this is just like this, how snapping allows you to create features, in this case of polygons that are connected to existing features on the map. So I've just finished creating this data set. And now I wanted to also show how we can use the new editing constraints. So currently we can see the tooltips update, like in this case, the distance. So let's say the distance of these 4 parcels was about 80.49 meters. I'll hit the tab key while I'm actively drawing, and I'll set the distance to, let's say 20, let's do 30 meters. So now it's constrained to only 30 meters for this particular edge while we're actively drawing. I'll place that feature, and then I could set, I believe it was like 80, I already forgot, 80, let's say 80 meters. So now it's set and it's constrained to that. We can also choose to do, let's say, we can also choose to do like angle as well. So let me set this length again. We'll do the 90 degrees on the 30 meters. So now it's set to the 90 degrees and the 30 meters. So I'll place that feature there, and then I will set this once again to, oops, it's just hiding behind here. Let's set this to 90 degrees again, and let's give this 50 meters. So now I can finish creating the feature. And so it's just an example of how we can use snapping and editing constraints to like actively draw your features. So I said we're going to see how we can configure snapping on load. So let's take a look at the code for that. So for the application, we are using, so this is for the map components application. We just wait for the view to load, and once the view is ready to load, we load all the layers currently on the map. And once we have access to the layers, we can loop through each layer, check if it's a subtype group layer or group layer. If we have those scenarios, then we grab the sublayers and push those as our feature snapping sources. But if we're just working with individual like feature layers, then we just push that into our array of feature snapping layer sources, which is what are the layers that will be configured for snapping. So once we have our feature snapping layer sources, we have our editor.snapping options object. We enable snapping on by default by setting this to true. Our geometry guides, which we saw the right angle indicators and parallel lines, are also enabled to true, because by default these are both turned off. And then we're passing in our collection of feature snapping layer sources. So currently every layer on the map, in this case there's only one. So by setting each layer to enabled, that's how we're seeing the snapping setup to be turned on for when you're working with this. Additionally, we have the tooltips enabled by default by setting the tooltip options property on editor to true. So that was just an example of how we can use the snapping and editing constraints together in our editing operations. Now let's jump into the form template. So by default, whenever you bring in your data and you're working with the form or editor, the form is going to load every single field and the layer for you. And that might not be necessary for every editing operation or every workflow. You might have 40 fields, but in your application, it may only be necessary to edit maybe 5 or 6. So if the way to configure how you want your form to be displayed, how many fields you want to be displayed, you can use the form template. So in this screenshot, we have all the default fields available. And then in this case, we're only showing 4 fields. I'm going to go through the code on how we're going to do this. So by setting a form template, it allows you to have like a cleaner display because you can only show maybe 4 or 5 fields instead of having people scroll through 20 different fields. You can set up your relationship if there's related records in your data. So maybe you have data where you have 3, 4, 5 related tables or layers. You may choose to only show 1 or 2 because that's all that matters in the editing workflows that you want to use within your application. So it gives you full control of that experience at the application level. It also supports arcade expressions. So if you want to further configure what runs when you're actively drawing, so you might have certain fields that are only visible if someone enters a particular value in a previous field. So the form is very flexible and allows you to bring in Arcade as well. So now let's take a look at an example for the form template. So here we have the same data set, the New Zealand parcel data, and I'm creating my form template. So here we're only showing 4 fields that I want to show. Total, I think there's over 10 in this data set. So we're only showing the parcel ID, land district, survey area, and the last updated date. So 4 fields we want to show. Here, so this is the use case where we're not working with the web map or a portal item. We're just bringing in our data from a feature service URL. So you just initialize our feature layer and pass in the feature service URL. And then I'll show the app before and after the form template. So let's look at our application. So right now, if I were to create, let me enable snapping. So this is the example where snapping is not enabled and you have to have your user do this manually on load. So let's just draw this parcel. And we'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 fields. No related records are currently being displayed. But if we go back and enable our form template that we created, save this, and let's refresh our application as it's loading with our current Wi-Fi on this conference. So I'll give it some time. But yeah, let's try this again. There you go. All right, so I will create our template, our layer. Let me enable snapping again. And let me finish creating this feature. So, sorry, then this is our editor form template. Okay, let's see why that's not being saved. Oh, I see why this is pointing to the local data set. Okay. Yeah, so, okay, if this isn't showing up, I'll show it afterwards. The correct one. Yeah, I think I'm showing the different application. Sorry about that. But let's jump into the next step. So we'll come back to this. So smart forms. The way we configured our form template programmatically, there's a way to author this through our user interface, which is available through like the map viewer or the portal map viewer as well from online or portal. And so you can have a user interface where you can choose which fields you want to display in your form. Also set up related records and set up your Arcade expressions. So these forms that you set up can be reused within Map Viewer, Scene Viewer, Experience Builder, Instant Apps because they're using the editor widget out of the box. And as you heard in the plenary, the smart forms, so the forms that we set up with smart forms are now going to be available in native as of the 200.4 release that's coming up. And then I'm going to show an example setting up a form, but if you want some examples of how to work with Arcade when you're setting up your applications and with Editor, the blog Go Beyond the Smart Editor using Smart Forms from our colleague Alex Ficina shows code examples of Arcade with an actual data set so you can see how you can set up your own Arcade expressions in your applications and your form. So let's take a look at that form template configuration. So here we have the New Zealand parcel data set that we've loaded in Map Viewer. So all you have to do is once you're in this view where you're seeing you have your layer selected, on the right, if you go to Forms, as long as you're signed in, you'll be able to see a list of the current fields for the layer on the right. So in this case, we have 7 plus the 4 on the left, so we have a total of 11 fields. So you can choose to, using this user interface, choose to add more fields, maybe remove some as well. And then here we have the permits and owners related tables. So you can choose to either hide some of these relationships if you don't want to delete them. So by default, this area is empty. So before our presentation, I moved some of the fields, so we're only displaying these fields in our widget. So if we go, let's add a few of these back, and I'll get rid of the related records. I'll hit OK. If I go into editor, see, we added the additional fields and we don't see our related records for now. But if I were to go back, let's add our related records back to our form, both of them. Let's remove the titles and appellations because we don't need that. Hit OK, and then we take a look at the form template. Sorry about that. Let's open editor, select the feature. Now we'll see the relationships back with the list of all our owners for this particular feature. So we have 4, and then we have the permits. So by using this web map ID that we have here, we can bring it into the editor, a widget just like we showed with our code earlier. Once you bring in the web map ID, all this form configuration is stored in the web map ID. So you don't have to programmatically set up the form template like I showed earlier. It's all done and saved through the web map. So it's a lot less code, and it can be shared across different applications and also now mobile. So now let's get into the applyEdits editing with the JavaScript SDK. So programmatic editing. So this is before the editor widget component was available. This is what we started with, feature layer.applyEdits. So we're programmatically editing our data. So to start, here we have a code example where we set up our geometry, we set up our attributes, and the attribute field names should match the field names in the layer. We then set up our graphic, which is equivalent to like a feature, so a graphic containing a geometry and attributes, and then we call feature layer.applyEdits. So this example that we have here is just programmatically adding a new feature into an existing layer. So now you can also not only do it like step by step where we only add one feature or update a feature, you can do it simultaneously. So this code example shows us adding features and deleting features in a single applyEdits call. And one thing that is not as common and is probably not as advertised is the return service edits option. So when working with enterprise feature services, there's 2 use cases where this is important. One, when you have attributes set up on your server that fire when you make an edit on one layer that might affect 3 or 4 other layers in that same feature service. If by default, the SDK does not refresh those layers, so you might not see those other edits across those layers in your application if you're just calling feature layer.applyEdits. Same thing with deleting composite relationships. If you have a composite relationship published, then if you delete the parent, the behavior is every single child that is in a relationship with that parent gets deleted through what we call cascade deletes. So again, that might be across different layers, so we want those edits to be refreshed, and we want all those edits to be available in the current view that we're seeing in our map. So by calling applyEdits with return service edit option set to original and current features, which we see in this code snippet on the right, that tells the layers from the JavaScript SDK that let's refresh every layer, not full refresh, just the edits that were sent and returned from the server, that we need to refresh these because they're no longer up to date. So we're gonna see some examples of that. So here we have an application where we have a parcel and a buildings feature layer. They're related to each other, so it's with the one-to-one relationship. This has attribute rules set up on the server. So in this example, if we update the owner and has owner fields in this parcel layer, it's going to send a request to the server, and the server is going to fire its attribute rules to update the buildings so they have the same owner as the parcel, and also the has owner property has been changed to yes because they now match the parcel. So this is all done through the edits we get back from the server after the attribute rules fire, and all we're doing is refreshing the layers with the latest edits. So that's the benefit of calling the return service edits option in these enterprise feature service specific workflows. So now I'll pass it back to John so he can show us some custom application he built to show some of the new workflows you can create.
Thanks, Jose. Cool. Thanks, Jose. So this might be a little different. I figured we talked about all these different editing components that we kind of provide out of the box, and that's well and good, but sometimes you might have a more specific editing workflow in mind, and what we provide doesn't just cut it, and there's a little bit more legwork involved. So I wanted to just create an app that kind of leverages several different of our tools to give you some ideas to go out and build more complicated editing experiences. So on your screen, what we have here is a map, and specifically it's a map of Boston, and I have street lamp data. So this is real street lamp location data. And the different colors represent like different states of these street lamps. So whether they're active, whether they need service, or whether they're out of commission, right? And then to the right of the map, we have kind of just this placeholder feature form. So this is our attribute updating component, right? And if you click this kind of table icon button here, you can kind of switch views and then see all the street lamps on our map here. So it's kind of nice. You can kind of choose how you want to interact with these features. But the whole kind of idea of this application is a way to quickly update multiple attributes on multiple features, so batch updating. And we can kind of approach that in several different ways. So we go back to our map, and I have a selection tool I've kind of wired up. So maybe we zoom in a little bit, and maybe we kind of draw an area to select. And okay, it looks like I've selected about 110 features. We can kind of zoom down to our 110 different street lamps, right? Alternatively, we can clear selection or pre-select a number. So we have 170 here. If I click the table, you might say, oh, well, there's no rows selected, so, maybe, because we're sorting by last inspection or last edit here in this case, I can't find my features. I might have to scroll a ways, and then I'm never going to see them all in the same kind of view. So what I did was I added a button to kind of leverage this behavior that the table has, where you can filter by the current selection, so then you kind of break it down and only see the features that are selected on the map or in the table in this case, right? So at this point, you can get a little more specific with your selection. Maybe I only really care about these 3 features or 4 features, right? So, when you actually go back to the map, you can see these 4 features are still the ones that are selected, right? So, but the idea is, maybe I want to add some notes for these, or maybe first I want to change the status to these to be all something consistent, right? Like service requested. So in this case, I'm going to update the status in my form. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit the save button. What happens is I disable the table so you can't interact with it in the meantime, and it automatically refreshes. And because we've sorted by basically the last time it was edited, we see the 4 features that we were interacting with, and we see the new value in the status field there at the top. So, with that said, also because our colors of these features are also tied to basically the status, you'll see they're all red now for disabled. So it's just a quick way to kind of interact with a bunch of different features, and you can get a little bit more specific in the sense that maybe you can look at the actual attribute values of all the features you've selected, try to figure out an average or sort of sum. And then, you can do other things with that as far as like automatically pushing different updates based on what your selection set is, right? So there's a lot of flexibility and power in doing that. Alternatively, maybe we want to, update this, some notes for some features, right? So I'm going to just select a smaller set. We're going to go back to our table. We're going to go to what did I do? I have 29 selected. We're going to clear our selection. We're going to reselect some. We're going to go back to the table. We're going to filter by the current selection. And then, I've kind of rigged up my app to, I can click this field here, and I'm going to hit Add Field to Form. So suddenly, I have all my, another field here in the form on the right, and I can enter some value here. Maybe we actually set these to disabled because they're broken, and then I can go ahead and save, and boom. So suddenly I've updated the notes for all of these features, right? So very similar, you can get really specific on what you allow the users to update. This is just kind of like an all-purpose demo for that case. Another thing that I thought would be kind of nice would be to show how to quickly undo the changes you've made. It's very similar to, we're using applyEdits under the hood, but the idea is, whoops, I made a mistake. I want to undo my changes. You can basically undo them all immediately. This app kind of caches the features in a current state and lets you go back. So, and I think that's most of the stuff, but we can go ahead and dig in and look more specifically about what we're doing in the code here, right? So just to get a little bit more specific, I'll just in interest of time, I might rush through some things, but feel free to come and ask me more specific questions. But these are kind of all the modules that this app is using under the hood. So things that we've talked about in this presentation already, or you may be familiar with the various widgets like feature form and feature table. We have various layers like feature layer and graphics layer. We have a map view. We have form template specific classes like field element and text area input for that notes display in the form that I added. And then we have some utilities that just make things really easy for us, like collection and reactive utils. And then our generic components like graphic and map, right? So this is just an example. This is just a kind of a preview of all the modules I'm using under the hood. So what I ended up doing for this app is I'm using a layer and not a web map because I wanted to configure the form template on the client, and this just seemed a lot easier for me to do and manage all the things like symbology, but you're not tied one way or the other. You can use a web map and override the form template that you've saved if you want to, right? So, and in this case, we're using a graphics layer to kind of represent and hold our selection graphic, that lasso that I drew to kind of batch select graphics on the map. We're going to create our map. We're going to use satellite, and we're going to create a map view. And it's going to center on, the city of Boston and at a particular zoom level that kind of fits all of the features in the view when the app loads. So from there, we're going to set up our form. What I'm doing is actually creating a placeholder graphic, like a dummy graphic, so to speak, and passing that to the form. And that graphic basically holds any and all changes I'm making through the form so that I can grab those changes later and then apply them to the features that I have selected. So I'm at the application level, I'm choosing what updates to apply to my features based on what changes are made in this form. And this is where you could, the sky's the limit, so to speak, where you could go in and do a lot more for things like arcade, auto calculation, and things like, based on where a graphic is located, attributes may change, things like Jose touched upon earlier. So, and I'm also creating a form template in this case with a single field status, so our drop down, right? So for our table, it's kind of similar. We configure it in a similar way with a table template. And in this case, I only want to show 4 columns here. And in one of my columns, I have that kind of custom menu thing at the top that lets me add the notes field to my form. So it's just me configuring the menu for that specific column so that I can basically invoke this method that updates my form template. So if we look down below, when I actually select that menu option to add the notes to my field, all I'm doing is cloning our current template, pushing a new field element, and then just assigning it back to the form, and it'll automatically refresh and render those field elements for you to interact with. And then for Sketch View Model, we're using Sketch View Model for the actual selection logic, the drawing, the lasso, and how I modified that in a symbolic way as far as I wanted it to look like a dash dot, like a typical lasso that you'd see in any sort of drawing app, not a full polygon with a background and a fill and a border. So I've kind of customized the symbols to make it look more like a generic lasso tool in that sense. And then the only thing we really need to do with our Sketch View Model is call create polygon and then tell it we're in freehand mode. So then it's that lasso experience that people are used to in various editing applications. So from there to actually get the selection to work, we need to react to Sketch's create event, we're only interested really when the sketch is complete. So we're checking with the event state. So we know, okay, I'm done drawing. At that point, I'm going to remove the graphic I just drew from the layer, and then I'm going to use that graphic's geometry to query for all the features contained within that geometry, that lasso, that polygon, right? So, and then from that point, I'm really interested in the object IDs for those features. So from my result set, my features, I loop through them, I grab all the object IDs, and I check if they're already highlighted in the table, because I don't need to highlight them if they're already selected, right? So at that point, we can decide, okay, we can basically add to the current selection. So it's kind of like you're adding to the current selection, but that's just because I wanted to do that in this app. You could do something where you remove all the other currently selected rows and then just use the ones you've selected, right? So that would be kind of up to you to decide, just as an example. And then at that point, I'm just calling highlightIDs.addMany for all the object IDs of the rows I want selected, the features. So, and then just, this is kind of interesting, and some people don't typically, this seems to be missed, but there's a difference between querying on a feature layer and a feature layer view. Typically, if you query on a feature layer, you're going to be making network requests. It's going to be going out to the service and grabbing features. But if you have a reference to the associated layer view of your layer because you've added it to a map view, the map view automatically generates a layer view. You can access and query on that layer view, and all queries will be client-side. There will be no network requests, and the requests will be fairly fast, responsive, right? So I get, basically, because we've already pre-downloaded our features and they're visible to you in the map, we don't need to go get them from the service again in this case, right? So we're just getting them from the layer view. And I thought that was important to call out. Absolutely. This will be shared, absolutely. The whole shebang. No, you're good. Yeah. We'll make sure it is, and don't worry. Maybe the link's wrong, but I pushed it there earlier. So we'll go over it at the end. I want to make sure I don't run out of time on everybody. So, so that's like how, so back to, layer view querying, highly recommended if you can, explore that. But of course you need a view. Sometimes you're working with data that has no geometries like table layers, and that's not really an option because when there's no view that you're really using in applications with just attribute data, right? So it's really helpful when there's geometries involved in getting access to those features. So one more thing about selection. I showed you a lasso drawing tool, but I actually forgot to show you, I wired up click selection. So when you click on the view, we use the view's hit test method, and all you do is basically pass it the click event from the view, and it tells you any and all graphics that were contained at that click location. So you don't have to do any sort of querying or interaction other than just using the hit test. And that's really nice because then you can, it's separate from the batch and bulk selection. You get more specific. In this case, I'm basically checking if I'm already selected or the feature's already highlighted, I unselect it. So it lets you, click on and off, click to toggle selection of features, right? So it's a combination of single click and then lasso select to keep my rows in sync with my features on the map. So, and everything again is done through highlight IDs. Everything in this application as far as selection goes is driven by the object ID via highlight IDs. So let's see, and because we rely on highlight IDs to basically know, what's selected. We can then, do things like update our UI based on highlight IDs. In this case, I'm using reactive utils. I kind of called it out briefly earlier, but it's one of our help utilities for reacting to changes on widgets and view models and basically classes, accessor-based classes. So it's really convenient to just, watch properties on some of these widgets, and then, you can update your UI just immediately based on those changes. Think of it like event handling, but without actual explicit named or event. You can, in this case, we're using a change event, but you can also use something like reactive utils.watch, pass it the raw property, and then it'll just work in that sense too. So in this case, yes, reactive utils is working off the change event, but events aren't required. So it's just super convenient. And then the actual batch editing part, this is where, you could get really, really, really detailed. You can spend 90% of the app logic in here trying to formulate how to actually, the best way to apply batch attribute updates, right? Because you might consider what the current values of your features are in that case. In my app's case, I don't really care, so it basically overrides those values regardless of what those features are. So, but this is where you could do some, subsequent validation. So all we're doing in our app is we're listening for a click on our save button, and then we're calling featureform.submit. And what that does is it tells the feature form to emit a submit event, and then it has all the information about the changes we've already made in our form. So in that case, the status and the notes potentially that we changed. And what's cool about that is, we can check, okay, do we actually have rows selected? Well, if not, then let's not do anything. And then feature form also has client-side validation. So we can confirm that the changes that we've typed in the form are actually valid before we go and hit up the service. So that's nice. It's kind of like we can just, you can even do things like tie the UI to featureform.submittable. Maybe the save button isn't even clickable if the form is submittable, right? So those are the kinds of customizations you might want to do. And then the rest of this is basically determining, based on our highlight IDs, our selected rows, what features I want to update. I have another method here that's very similar to the one before, where we were finding all the features contained within a geometry. Instead, I'm just finding all the features that have these object IDs. So once I have the full features, I'm going to clone them, and this is important for undo redo. So at that point, because I've cloned my features before I've actually updated them, I have a sort of a snapshot of what those features are in time. So what ends up happening is, as we go through, we update our non-clones, and we set those attribute values, and then we call layer.applyEdits. We're going to pass in our update features. It's an array of features. These are all the features I'm updating. And then depending on the response, did it pass or fail? If the edit failed, we don't really want to do anything too much else, right? We might want to say, hey, error. But if the save was successful, at that point, yeah, we can say, okay, I'm going to add all my clones to this undo history, which is just a collection or an array. And we're going to refresh our table, so to make sure our table is showing the latest updates based on our changes, and then we can make it interactive by hiding the loading indicator, right? So, but what's really interesting with the undo is, because I've added those clones, if I decide, man, I made a mistake on that last edit, we can basically, use these clones. We use the last entry in our undo history, and we treat them just the same as we did for updating in the last step. We call layer.applyEdits, and we'll pass those old clones because those attributes have not been updated, right? So it's an undo by basically just repeating what we did, but with the old, now stale, so to speak, features, and they become, it ends up being a sort of undo visually, right? So and that's important too, because those are still updates, and things like last edit date would reflect that, right? Like, you can't undo a change and then the edit date on the feature is different, right? It's going to reflect the fact that you did update it, even if it is considered an undo. So that's just important to note. And then similar, like, I don't want the undo button to be highlighted if there's nothing to undo. So in this case, we're watching the length of the undo history collection and then disabling it if it has nothing in it. So that's, I think, most of the app. And again, this will all be shared. If you have any more questions, feel free to come up. And I'm going to pass it back over to Jose. He's got another demo to show.
Thanks, John. So lastly, sorry about that. Not yet. Ready for that? So I wanted to show the demo from Plenary that we set up and kind of walk through it, because we didn't have a chance to see some of the code and kind of want to slow down and show a little bit of explain a little bit more about the behavior. So we started off in the Plenary demonstration by switching to a different version. So with the new version management component, the map that was developed within this last release, you now have access to to see different versions that you use using your branch versioning workflow. So what I did was we switched to a version we wanted to edit, because by default, whenever you bring in your data into the web SDK, so the JavaScript SDK, you're pointing directly to the SDE default. So for the branch versioning workflows, we're always pointing to SDE default. So that's why if we use the version management component, we can have a user interface to allow people to switch to a version and only edit at that version, so we're not affecting other people's data. Because prior to this, this was only available through programmatically setting each feature layer .applyEdits in your map, and this just is a lot more convenient, user-friendly way to do that. This component also has the ability to create new versions, so you don't have to go into Pro and start creating your versions. You can assign it a name, test for demo, assign a description, and also the access type from public, protected, or private. You can also set the owner of who you want the version to be assigned to. So if you're like an administrator, you can assign these versions to other people. So they don't have to be the ones creating your versions. So this allows you to, right now we're only supporting creating versions, altering versions, so you might already have existing versions that you want to reassign to somebody else, maybe change the name, maybe change the description or access type. What I did next was we went into Editor and started to attempt to create some new features, so the residential service line. So I showed that snapping was enabled on entire data set. So here we're working with the subtype group layer since we're showing utility network data set. And we were not able to snap to this feature because of the rules that fire from the utility network. So whenever you publish utility network data set, you publish a service containing rules that dictate like which features can be snapped to or not. So in this example, it was important to show that you can't snap to these features because the rules don't tell you, and you don't have to add any extra code to your application. This is all done out of the box from the editor component. And then so instead, I first placed a tab feature, which there is a rule that says that we can snap to this. And then now if I try to add the residential service line again, then because there's a rule to snap to the tab, that we're able to start drawing that. And we already saw the editing constraints, so I'll just finish creating the feature. I'm not going to walk through the rest of the demo because that was more focused on the utility network rules with tracing. But again, just to reiterate, all that was done in that particular version we switched to. What I also wanted to show how you can do this programmatically as well using some of the version management service class that was released within the last year. So if you don't want to use the version management component, your application is not ready to bring in the component, we have a sample in the JavaScript SDK that shows you how to do this using our version management service class. So here we have a sample that same thing, it allows you to switch to different versions, so like see different data sets. So as you can see, it reacts to what version we're switching to as we refresh the layer. Here's the code on how under the hood the version management component is working. So we instantiate a version management service class. So we're passing the URL to the endpoint to the version management service. So if you have a feature service published with branch versioning, there's a couple endpoints. You have an endpoint to the full feature service URL, and you have access, an endpoint to the version management service as well. So that's the URL that we're seeing here. And once we initialize the version management service, we call load. Once we call load, we have access to some of its information and metadata on that service that we're setting. So the way the list works, how we list the versions in the version management component, is we call the version management service.get version info, so we get enough information to list it in a user-friendly way. So, and then finally, just changing the version. We're calling the method on the version management service, a change version, where we specify, you can pass in an array of feature layers, or subtype group layers, any layer supported with versioning. You pass in the current version and then the version that you want to switch to. So if we look at this sample, here we have the feature layer we want to pass to, the version management service we initialize, and then we're listing the version using we're using the get current version infos to list it, and then we populate our panel based off the information we get back. So this is not a widget, this was just a user interface developed just to show how you can create your own user interface once you have access to this information for these different versions. And then we just have an event listener on each list item that we're using here since we're using Calcite, so you can switch to that version. So we're calling that change version anytime you click on one of these inputs. So the version management service class that I'm talking about is this one right here. And there's a lot more workflow supported with the version management service that didn't share, because you have access to the version management service. You can call start editing, which adds a lock on the version management service. So that means when someone's editing your data and you have a lock set on this version, no one else can change their version and view that version and start editing that data. So you can further restrict that by having one user edit the data at a time. So right now the version management component doesn't do that out of the box, but that's why I'm showing how if you wanted to set up your workflow, you can use the version management service to do that. So additional supported workflows are for the version management service is the reconciled and post. You can now have a undo, redo history because all that is saved within the version management service if you have a current edit session. So you can do that. You can go use undo, redo by calling the methods in the version management service and so on. So if you're interested in the branch versioning workflow supported with the JavaScript SDK, this is a class to start with. And if you want a user-friendly interface for people to interact with that data, you can go in and use that version management component. And yeah, you can create as many applications as you like. And I did promise to show the form template working. So just before we pass it on to the questions, here are the 4 fields. Currently, this one doesn't have related records, but let's jump into one that does. So this was the programmatic approach to setting up your related records. So let's jump back to that data set, to that code real quick. So just to verify, same field elements. I also added a relationship element just so we could see the related tables. So you don't need a web map ID, you don't need a portal ID. If you have a feature service URL with your related records, make sure that those layers are added to the map and the tables, if you're have any relationship to tables, that the tables are also added to the map. Otherwise, you won't be able to see your relationships. So again, this code is going to be available to all you all who want to take a look at it, bring in your own data and start testing it with the applications that we developed specifically for this demo today. So the slides, again, one more time, let me do this full screen.
And I wanted to say thank you. The demo is up there now.
Yeah. I'll add the plenary application as well. That one's not there yet. Every other application should be on there as well. So we'll,
For QA, I think?
We'll leave that out there. Will have any questions? Yes.
When you hit apply, so I have a mobile web app that can be disconnected quite frequently. ApplyEdits, if that fails, does it do anything in the background to retry, or do I just need to get the updates and store them locally for my retry at some point in my application, or does the SDK do anything for connectivity?
The question was if we call applyEdits and it fails, is there anything saved? Like what's the next step to do? If it fails, applyEdits fails, then you have to resubmit that applyEdits whenever you have access to that internet. Yeah, that's currently how it works. Yeah, you're gonna have to check because applyEdits, once it completes, it returns a promise and tells you if it succeeds or not. So if it fails, then you can have in your application, oh, this has failed. So you might be able to store those edits, kind of like John showed using clones. So you always have access to the edits before you send them out. So if it fails, you still have them locally, so you can resend it once you have that internet connection. So you still have information to tell you, hey, this failed or not.
And the object IDs and everything have already been created at that point, right? Like for a new edit, like it's ready to go. I just need to send it.
The object ID will be created by the server. The editor doesn't do that for you. Yeah.
That's the big thing when creating. You don't have to give it any sort of unique identifier. It'll tell you what the unique identifier is in the response when it tells you it succeeded. So then you can do other things with that OID, because to edit, that's like the key, right? So
The other example is if you're using global IDs, there's an option in the applyEdits where you can set to set the global ID set that to true. That's when editor will create a global ID for you and then send it to the server. Because if you don't have that enabled, the server will create that global ID for you. So there's that option as well. So you can do feature layer, create that global ID for you from the JavaScript SDK, or have the server do it for you. So that's another option. Any other questions?
cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.